Okay, we are live. I guess without further ado, I'd like to invite the first affirmative speaker to begin debate.
Hi, can you all hear me? Many animals are born with a self-defense mechanism where in the few moments before their death, they are willing to risk it all in the possibility of of survival. But often in their cases, they're willing to do things like rip out their internal organs in order to have a fleeting chance at survival. We tell you that in the case of humanity, the chances of your survival are incredibly improbable and likely involve subjecting humanity, they say all of it, to immeasurable pain in their last moments. Two issues in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to explain to you why there is no inherent good in allowing humanity to continue surviving. And secondly, I'm going to explain why life on this train is particularly bad. First issue, why humanity is not uniquely good. And I think the first thing to say at the beginning of this debate is the vast majority of us in the way in which we view issues is viewed through an anthropocentric lens. That is to say that we often view issues or view dilemmas or moral dilemmas that we have to face with the view that as long as humanity has some odds of survival or is able to continue with some chance, it's going to be something that's inherently good. That's good. We tell you that it's not something that should not be that we should not take into consideration in this case for a few reasons. We tell you that the norm that is created, the norm of viewing everything in an anthropocentric way, is something that has largely been fostered by our own biology, our own biology's desire to keep our spirits living, but also by religion, but also by the forces of capital that want to ensure that we keep working to make sure that the elites are necessarily placated. We tell you that there is no higher order need for why humanity ought to survive. Therefore, we think that those considerations should fall out. Should necessarily fall out for this debate. We tell you that in order for life to be worth living, it has to deliver some kind of positive happiness, some sort of value, or some sort of joy to some of its constituents. In a world where we aren't able to fill that goal, we think that we should end humanity. We also tell you that in many instances under current society, we allow individuals to end their own lives should they think that their life is not worth living. We think that it's perfectly legitimate for elderly people who are undergoing terminal illnesses, who are likely going to live the remainder of their lives in immeasurable pain to end their lives where they see fit. But also, in the case where if we only had two individuals who are left surviving on Earth in humanity's last and final darkest days, we say that it would be perfectly legitimate for those two individuals to also commit suicide. And we don't think that the burden of humanity to have to continue should lie on those two individuals in order to keep going. So we say that humanity's considerations should be outside the realm of this debate. This debate is only about the well-being or the happiness that individuals on that train can possibly get. But why is life particularly bad on that train? Well, we say that at a first level that the ecological collapse that has happened in the rest of the world is something that humanity is never going to likely surmount. We tell you that you're never going to likely come off that train. Ice ages and the ice age that's occurred in this film often survive for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's unclear whether or not those ice ages are ever going to end or whether or not you're ever going to be able to get off that train in any world. But moreover, we tell you that the human element or the engineering that we've done to control the climate has massively backfired. That's probably going to extend this ice age and make life unlivable for a far longer period of time. What that means is that these humans who live on this train are never going to be able to be let out. They're never going to be able to go out and farm and produce more resources to accumulate more food to make life for the individuals on that train. Life for that individuals on that train any better. But moreover, we tell you that the life that people live on this train is an incredibly precarious situation. They're often one or two landslides away from all of their existence is being ended anyway, and the point at which you're living under that constant uncertainty, it's pretty bad in the way in which it tortures your mind. Why why is it necessarily true that all the individuals outside of those considerations, that you're never going to be able to return to a period of normalcy, you're never going to be able to return to a normal life, still bad? Well, it's a numbers game on this train. So in this train, you currently have a very small segment of a few elites compared to like hundreds and hundreds of poor people who also live on that train. Even if you're able to somehow redistribute resources to those poor people, we say that life is still going to be not worth living if you choose to live on that train. What's it like for the poor individuals who live on this train? You live in incredibly cramped spaces. You're never able to see outside light, and you often are driven to insanity when you're forced to spend extended periods of time in these cramped situations. Right? That's why in the film, the vast majority of vast majority of the poor people on that train have already resorted to means like suicide to go end the suffering that you necessarily have. You're often at the brink of starvation when you live on these trains, given that you're not going to be able to produce any food outside of the train. It's very hard to grow food during an ice age. It's unlikely that your material circumstances are ever going to improve. But moreover, the problem of crime and the problem of overpopulation run rampant in this train. And the point at which you're pushed to your limit and you have no other means to survive, you're likely going to resort to crime. But the final thing to say here is that overpopulation often runs rampant in these on this train. The fact of the matter is that the central planning authority that exists on this train has often had to resort to techniques to cull the population to make sure that there is enough food for the remaining population to survive. That's a pretty abhorrent choice that we wouldn't want to subject any of humanity to necessarily go through. But even if you're an elite on this train, you know that you still suffer all of the psychological damage of living in such a cramped space, never being able to see daylight again, which absolutely tanks the dopamine levels that you might necessarily have. That's why the central planners on this train have had to resort to things like instilling fear, like having to make sure that there are consistent revolutions that happen on this train to make sure that people still have some semblance of sanity in order to continue living. I'll take a POI right now if you have one.
The trains only existed for like 15 years. Why should we assume a dictatorial, like strongly class society is the only possible way for the train to survive?
Okay, that leads me quite nicely to my second point, which is about why you're never going to be able to institute any sorts of reforms on this train. The first thing that I'd like to note is the material I've already brought to you, which is that people are under psychological duress, and the only thing that's keeping them sane are the perpetual revolutions that are happening in this train to keep that level of fear instilled in individuals to want to keep living. Without that, they probably would likely all commit suicide in this world. But the second thing on why redistribution isn't necessarily going to work is because it's a numbers game, right? You don't have enough food to feed even the elites on the train at the moment, let alone the hundreds of poor people who currently live. So even if you redistribute all of the resources that exist on that train, that's just going to result in a situation where everyone is going to be equally worse off, and everyone is starving at the end of the day. That means that you've not only quashed a little bit of happiness that any sort of elites might be able to enjoy, but you've also distributed that misery far greater than it initially needed to be. At the end of this, recognize the simple fact that humanity in its current situation is living at a time where no happiness can be found. That's why we're so proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that speech, first affirmative, and I'd like to invite the first negative speaker to begin their team's case.
Millions of human beings throughout the history of the world have been through things worse even than what we experienced in Snowpiercer. We point to the example of the Holocaust, where people were marched into death camps. Those people didn't give up, they didn't commit suicide, they saw that their life had worth, they saw that life is worth living. Even at the very lowest, humans overwhelmingly have a revealed preference for life. They continue to enjoy life, even at the very worst possible life you can think of. The majority of people prefer life over death. Even if you think they don't, though, let's allow them to give that choice. Yes, we allow euthanasia. No, I can't make that choice for you. We allow people to choose for themselves whether life is worth living, not one person at the front of the train crashing it for everyone. Okay, 3 questions then in today's debate. Firstly, a bit of context around what we think Curtis would be like as a leader, then why we think there's still hope for humanity in a broader sense in terms of a Thor, and then thirdly, even if there's no Thor and even if we're stuck on the train, why we should still choose to continue living life in the meantime. First, though, some strange rebuttal about like humanity not being worth it. Look, we think it's probably just in the first instance fine for humans to be anthropocentric and that they're like likely the only sentient source of life, right? But also, we tell you that like if all human life is meaningless, there's just no debate. It doesn't matter either way. Like worst case, some meaningless beings continue going on a train. That's not a harm if it's meaningless. Finally, the other line they took was that we should value the lives of human beings now, but not humanity as a whole. I don't understand why it matters like when someone is alive, if their life matters, right? Like morality doesn't change depending on the time. It's not that I can like murder someone at 5 o'clock and it's moral, but if I did it at 1 o'clock, it's not. Clearly, if a human life matters now, future human lives also matter. So we should also value those future potential human lives, or those unborn humans that would carry on if we didn't crash the train. But then Chen gave you the example of like when we do allow people to end their lives. Look, we're happy to stand by those. We tell you that like if you do want to euthanize yourself because you think your like life has negative future utility, we're happy to make that choice. You think you're the only person who can make that choice and not a leader at the front of the train. That's why we let people make those decisions. We don't make it on behalf of others. Okay, bit of context then around what we think Curtis is going to be like as a leader. Look, Curtis has lived through the very worst of the train. He was at the back for his entire life, and he has seen all the worst parts of that train throughout its entire history. But what did that lead him to do? It meant he took a group-focused approach, right? Because he understood that in that community, the only way they could survive is if they worked together. So that's why he naturally just became a leader, right? That's why he was able to unite people, because he understood that. It's the only way you can survive at the bottom. But even at the worst times, what he's tried to do is he's always tried to minimize the harms to the group, right? Because he values people's lives. So I mean, like instead of eating a baby, he ate someone's arm, for example, in order to like try and minimize the level of harm when they were forced to turn to cannibalism. More importantly, though, he has commanded the respect of all the people at the back of the train. He is a good leader. They could choose any leader out of the like dozens of people at the back of the train. He had those qualities that caused people to respect him. So what that means, they has broadly just like a utilitarian outlook on life, right? He does value humanity. He wants to maximize the total amount of welfare in the train. So he probably isn't going to just like if he was just a selfless person, right? He would have used his leadership of the poor for his own means. He would have used his like social capital, just live a good life in the back rather than lead a revolution in which is incredibly likely he would die. Clearly, he's aimed at group survival. He differs from Wilford in these lived through the worst. Those that if they redistribute resources, they can have a good life. So he's likely to do that. Okay, before I go on, I'll take that point.
So if there was a person born and throughout their entire existence they were tortured, is that a life worth living, or is that a net harmful situation?
Look, it's up to them, right? If they think that they're going to be tortured for the rest of their lives, the logical choice in that scenario would probably be to not survive. Let them make that choice. Don't make it for them. Okay, why is that hope for humanity then? Look, the first thing to say here is that we don't condemn humanity for doing bad things in terrible situations. When people are forced to steal, when people are forced to murder to survive, we recognize that's because they have a biological drive to survive. It doesn't tell us about something about the value of humanity as a whole. So to the extent that humans have done terrible things on the train, we don't think that past record is an indictment of humanity in general. What we do see in all humans, though, is that there is purpose from life, right? Even in the worst cases scenario, even the people at the back of the train get value from things like relationships, from having friendships, from the hope that tomorrow will be a better day. Just your own random happiness when you get like slightly more food, or when the like cockroach bar that you get is slightly sweeter than the previous one. Those small things that make life worth living. We tell you they have a real preference for having a purposeful life. Firstly, in that they continue to have children, they continue to bring people into the world believing that life is worth living, but also that they choose to continue living themselves. The option on that train was always available to commit suicide. You just run at a guard and they would shoot you. If you think your life isn't worth living, that option is available to you as an individual. The other reason why we think you're likely to have a good life on the train is it's just broadly self-sufficient, right? This isn't your typical like AT transport like train, right? It's a massive, essentially a luxury cruise, and it's self-sufficient to a huge degree. So you are able to survive without the need for future culls like this. To the extent that cull has happened and it worked, that's bought you a lot of time before you next need to worry about population. In that, you can use that time to do things like institute strict cultural norms. You can like hand out condoms to people at the back of the train so they don't have kids. That removes the need for future culls. It means that you can control the population without being brutal. You don't need to resort to cannibalism. You can build a much better society. Note here that the train has only existed for 15 years. They've only tried one way of running the train, which is a dictatorship of like the really rich guy who created it. Clearly that didn't work and led to bad outcomes. Let's give like a better leader a try, someone like Curtis, who's lived through the worst, who's not going to be selfish. Secondly, look, the first thing to note here is that they have lived objectively awful lives, right? So that means even if you can make the tiniest possible improvement, to them, that is awful. They've come from having to resort to cannibalism. They've come from having to eat cockroach bars. Being able to have like a bit of sushi once a week from the buffet trains at the front of the train is a massive improvement to your life. Just like not having to worry about like eating your own child, it's clearly a huge improvement, even if the food you're eating is incredibly plain or something like that. Let's note, though, that the front of the train had absolute opulence. They had massive buffet cars. If you redistribute those resources, you're only going to get better compared to what they had at the very back when they were forced to resort to cannibalism. Thirdly, just canonically, there's signs of life in the outside world, right? The world is thawing. They've noticed this. That's why they were going to blow the doors originally, and that's why like the ending scene has like something peeking through the ice. But also, you don't have to rely on the entire world thawing, right? Ice ages don't cover the entire world. There's going to be parts of the world that warm up far before others. So you can start working out like whether you're able to leave the train, leave small expeditions that you pick up next year when you come back around. We think you're going to be able to maintain social cohesion in this situation because now you have a strong leader from the people who is respected and who's able to gain their respect. So you're not going to have another rebellion because people like a leader. People probably, would reasonably willing to believe will institute some sort of like primitive democracy in order to stay in power. Okay, even if the world doesn't thaw though, why is life on the train still worth living? Look, the first thing to know is that ice ages don't last forever. So if you can survive for like 500 years, that's a period where you'll likely then lead to the ice age thawing anyway. But also we tell you that people on the train have a life better than cavemen. They have a life better than like many human beings alive today. So that life is worth living itself. Finally, even if it's inevitable that you have death at the end, the outcome is the same, that now all of humanity has died, but at least in the brief period of 100 or 200 years where you're able to survive, people live lives where they made friends, where they did fun things, where they lived like lives they were proud of, where they got up every day and were like happy to be alive. Ultimately, the original problem with the train was one person at the front thought he could quantify the value of the lives of every other person in that train and make decisions on their behalf. That's clearly not true. We want to leave people to decide the worth of their own life to themselves. We don't want dictatorial ending for everyone else's life. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech, first negative, and I'd like to invite the second affirmative speaker to continue their team's case.
Just give me a sec. I just need to organize my notes. Awesome. Ready? The problem with side negatives case is that they say a lot of nice things that they think is intuitively believable. The fact that you can always struggle through any situation and get through it. The act of living itself and forming relationships on some level, having a more tasty cockroach bar after you had a bad one is some form of good life. But that isn't the case. It's the lie told to us by our biology that life is important, removes the choice from us to actually not suffer. The fact that life is suffering is true in general, in my opinion, but specifically more true in these circumstances. Note two things before I get into the matter I'm going to talk about. The harms that we brought to you mean that people on this train have far, far worse lives than even cavemen. Why? Because the quality of life and the way that we enjoy life was based through that evolution. So it requires things like wide spaces, natural sunlight, and the ability to form meaningful relationships without being in fear. Those are the kinds of things that are always taken away from people in this train, not just the poor individuals, but just individuals living in that train. So the extent of harm that we're talking about in terms of how you don't have a good quality of life, and you in fact suffer every day, happen on a biological evolutionary level to everyone on that train. The second point to note here is, no, thank you, this is not necessarily an active debate. The outcome of like the good leader that is Curtis isn't solving the societal reasons why you had to have revolutions again and again. All those revolutions that happened before probably had the same good leaders that had the command of the poor people in the back carts, but always had to go back to the same system. It's unclear why on the third attempt now, you have this sudden massive reform that doesn't respond to all the analysis you heard at Chen. 3 points in my speech today. Firstly, about the principle and how you should weigh this debate, because note they were very, very dismissive of the way we want to characterize the principle, the metric of how this debate actually falls. Secondly, about the suffering that goes on in this train and proving to you why this means that a principle should be enacted to prevent the vast amount of suffering, not just for people who live right now, but yes, future individuals are going through the same suffering if they're brought into this world. Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about reform and why their fantasy world is unlikely and never going to happen, and how they're not going to survive this ice age. Firstly, the principle very basically. What we said at the first level is that the fact that you want to continue humanity and live for the sake of living doesn't have a principal basis to it, and we challenge them to provide it. The only response they gave was, oh, people care about humanity. But that is not a reason why objectively why it's a good thing to keep people suffering just because you care about some other idea of humanity. The core part of this is that we are unclear as to why you would prioritize the whole over its constituents, right? So if the people in this crowd have overall suffering and a justified, like a legitimate suffering that's going to continue for a long period of time, there's no reason to think we should care about the whole of humanity in general. The second point to note is that they were talking about when we should care about future human life existing. But again, that presupposes some sort of, it's contingent on them getting better outcomes in the future. I've already given you, and Chen has given you analysis as to why existence on this train in general is bad for human beings, and they probably don't have a net positive but rather a net negative outlook in life. Like the person who gets tortured every day of his life probably probably would be better off not existing, is the case that we're talking about. The second point to note is that if we do care about people in the future, which we shouldn't because they don't exist yet, they still would have the same suffering. So that harm is going to continue on those instances. Then they said choice, that you should value this person's choice and not take it away from them. First thing to note is we remove choice from people if there's harm to that individual and they're unable to make that decision. Chen already told you, and I'll repeat again, people can't make the choice to kill themselves because they're biologically wired to stay alive. That's why individuals find it very, very hard to kill themselves in general, have to use a gun. But the point there is that the biology that traps you and keeps you wanting to stay alive isn't like the objective metric of whether it's good to be alive, and we can prove the suffering that exists means that it would be better off for that person not to be alive. Furthermore, people didn't choose to come into existence, right? You are born into the world and trapped in there to the extent that your own biology forces you to stay alive. That's a harm that we think we can take away a choice from the person, from these people, if it's beneficial overall. So why is it beneficial overall? Why is the harm existing? Before that, I'll take a point.
Okay, so from my privileged position, I might think that someone who is homeless or lives in a slum is living a life that's not worth living. Is it my responsibility to take a machine gun to that person because I'm freeing them from their biological imperative and sending them to heaven?
No, because there are tons of other ways that you could help that person, and there are other ways that situation could get better. But the point is that in this Snowpiercer universe, it's actually not going to get better, but also the harm that I told you about is always going to continue for all future people. So actually, let me get into the reform point better, because that is literally the entire case is to try and prove that things get much better overall. Let's talk about the context here. They said, oh, the ice age is getting better, there's thawing happening. First note that ice ages, like the past one, took 10,000 years. The climate takes a long time to readjust. So that means that you likely have to survive in this situation for 10,000 years with all that suffering that exists there. Note, there is no harm from not having humanity in the future, right? The harm that people aren't born yet doesn't actually, it's not a harm that accrues to anyone because that person was never going to be born in our world anyway. So the harm for 10,000 years is something that they need to wear up against some potential benefit. The second point to note is that they're this close to being destroyed anytime there's a snow slide that covers the tracks and the train goes off kilter, right? Because the reason the train's running is to keep it warm, all that sci-fi stuff. There is no guarantee that in the future, after the 10,000 years of an ice age, that they're likely going to survive. So all that future benefit means that harms from being trapped in a train without cramped spaces, overpopulated natural light exist. Let's talk about why reform is important, is impossible. Note that just because Curtis is a good leader doesn't mean that he's any different from all the other leaders that have tried to reform this train. So there's likely going to be the same pressures that acted on him. What were they? Chen gave you 3 of them. Firstly is that it's impossible to redistribute the amount of food that you would have on the train, given the numbers of elite people that exist versus the hundreds of people who are in poor situations. That because resources being finite means that you are then unable to ever extend that food across to all those people to a meaningful extent. So yes, maybe you can have, let's say the life for someone is really, really bad, like minus 100 utils or something. You increase it to like 98, but it still doesn't change the actual level of net benefit or harm that goes on to every single person on that train. It's a numbers game in the instance we've already provided you that. The second point to note is that there have been several revolutions. Obviously, if reform was possible in the first instance, they would have kept it. Note, this point, the reason why this society works like this in the train isn't because of any power-hungry individual who wants to keep the elite balance. It's literally for political reasons. The movie itself acknowledges that people who live in these really bad conditions are likely to be chaotic, are likely not to follow social order. So fascist social order has to be imposed on them. And because of overpopulation that naturally increases after a while, because like I said, people want to have children and feel some sort of emotional connection, means that overpopulation is going to increase even if you start handing condoms out. It's likely then again, you'll have to either have that social pressure there to ensure that there's some sort of survivability, otherwise you're going to just devolve into chaos, or overpopulation happens again, you have to cull people again and again. And that's another harm that they need to accept on their side. If they want this train to survive for like 10,000 years until the ice age is over, that means that people have to die meaninglessly over and over again, while some people live in a relatively good quality of life. Overall, if you weigh that up, it's a very harmful outcome for those individuals. The last point I note is that the human condition in general requires surplus production to survive. The moment that you don't have enough resources and there's no food or like no resources, that's when humans turn on each other, and that's another reason why you can't have the utopian society they want to live on their side. At the end of this debate, you have to either be foolish enough to accept the utopian condition that side negative wants to talk about, where you try your best and hope for a better future while sacrificing everyone to ultimate suffering. I don't think we should do that. Let's just end that suffering now.
All right, thank you to second affirmative for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the second negative speaker to continue their team's case.
Yes, euthanasia is morally tenable. However, for their case to be consistent and to make sense, Shah would have to be okay with me involuntarily euthanizing his grandmother with terminal cancer, because I have decided that even if she's having a great time being able to say goodbye to her loved ones on her deathbed before cancer ravages her and finally kills her, that's not good enough, and that she shouldn't be living that life regardless of her personal lived experience. And I should never be able to make that decision, nor should anyone else. Curtis shouldn't be either. Okay. So a couple points in this debate. Firstly, what does life on this train actually look like? And further on, should Curtis deprive people of the ability to decide themselves whether their lives are worth living? So firstly, on what does life on this train look like? It's not good enough for Shah to come up here and just ignore the canon of this film. I'm a fan of this film, and I can tell you that actually this is the first successful revolution that has managed to actually unseat the conductor. Yes, the conductor kind of orchestrated this revolution, but that is because the conductor realized that he is old, he doesn't have that lived experience of the poor people in the back of the train, and that it was time for him to hand over the mantle. This means that this is a unique opportunity for the kind of culture of this train and for the society of this train and the way that it's made up to be changed in a way which could radically change the lives of the people in that train. So it's not good enough for Shah to simply assert that actually revolutions have happened in this train all the time. None of them have been successful. Everything is doomed to be as it has been for the past 15 years. But also, let me just say that the big flaw with their case is that it is based on the premise that all resources on this train are finite. That is also not the case. So some resources are finite. For example, this revolution was mainly successful because they realized that the guards ran out of bullets and did not have the bullets to contain a revolution. However, much of the materials that is needed to sustain and live not only a life with bare minimum, but in fact a life that could be considered by anyone, even from privilege, to be passable, certainly not bad enough to kill yourself and decide that they should kill themselves. And what this looks like is the train is self-sufficient in the sense that, yes, on the worst level, they do eat reconstituted bugs at the back of the carriage, but actually the rich people at the front of the train, which have been unseated and many of them killed, and now these resources can be redistributed more equally, and I'll explain why that's likely under Curtis. What this looks like is actually there are whole carriages dedicated to farming. There are whole carriages that have totally self-sufficient, like fish farms, right, that allow the rich to have eaten sushi every day for the past 15 years on this train, right? This means that actually it's not such that there is a finite amount of resources that will run out and they are doomed to die, because even if they were not to make any kind of advancements, even if they were not to ever leave the train or ever be able to leave the train, there is still enough resources which do replenish themselves to live not only a passable life, but a pretty decent one at the point in time that these resources are able to be redistributed against amongst the people on the train. Now, why is that likely? So 2 points here. Firstly, it's worth noting that the population has been significantly culled by this revolution. That means that not only were the rich hogging up a majority of the resources because they thought that, you know, that was their just desserts because they were rich and they deserved it, but also even on the level that there are less people now, that means that there are more resources to go around, fewer people. However, we also tell you that it's more likely under Curtis that the resources that do exist, that do replenish themselves, are more likely to be equally distributed. Why is this the case? So we think that, one second, Shah, we think that the biggest difference between Curtis and the train conductor is that Curtis does have that lived experience of coming from that back carriage. He knows what it's like to grow up in poverty. He knows what it's like to have to eat his father figure's arm because otherwise he would die. And so he understands that the group mentality should be equitable, that he should care for those that have less in society, and it's far more likely that he will redistribute those resources in a way that is more equitable. It was curious for Chen Chen to talk about like central planning as some, like, I don't know, dog whistle for like socialism or something, when the fact that this train conductor orchestrated this revolution and started this whole train in the first place is the only reason why anyone can be alive today, which we think is fundamentally a good thing. And I'll prove that in my second. Yes, Shah.
So these resources that keep renewing are obviously only renewable after it's sustainable, only because you're feeding a few people and it grows again. How, when you feed everyone and redistribute this, will you not be completely destroying that resource?
Right. So firstly, there's significantly fewer people in the train now. Literally, I think 74% of people in this train have like been culled. There is a far lower amount of people. That means that what resources do exist will go further. But we also tell you that it was the rich hogging themselves, eating nothing but sushi, having nothing but martinis, right? Because they thought that that was what they were entitled to. We do not think Curtis will have the same mentality. We've told you that Curtis has a revealed preference for caring for those that have less, and he's far more likely to distribute that in another way. So it means, yeah, even if they're not picking themselves on sushi the whole time, the like comparative increase in quality of life from having nothing but reconstituted cockroaches to having sushi once a week is like a pretty big fucking jump, right? And like, not only is it a big jump, but if they weren't like, if we were shown that these people weren't like killing themselves in droves while eating only reconstituted cockroaches, it's even more likely that they would not want to kill themselves when they are living a comparatively better life. Okay, so secondly, recognizing that this is what the circumstances on the train actually look like, should Curtis deprive people of the ability to decide whether their lives are worth living? So what we heard from them was this idea that actually, like, thinking about humans, like thinking that humans should exist as an anthropocentric worldview. However, we just didn't know why this was a bad thing. We were never told why it was bad to have an anthropocentric worldview, because this harm is incredibly reductive, right? Because on on this level, we tell you that it doesn't necessarily matter if it's incredibly irrational for people to want to be alive. Firstly, we can test that is true to begin with. We tell you that actually, we don't think it was irrational for people in Auschwitz to want to push through and to want to survive. But we tell you that even if we buy into all of their material here, even if we say it's incredibly irrational for these people to want to be alive, that simply doesn't matter, because the reality is, if they do feel like it is good to be alive, if they do enjoy being alive, and that's shown in the revealed preference of not killing themselves, of putting their life on the line to go through that revolution in the first place, to try and secure their existence before they were killed by the guards, before they were killed by the rich, we tell you that this means that that is their reality. So we can't look at any sort of concept of empirical fact and what actually should matter, because it simply doesn't matter for these people, for their lived experience. And that's the reason why there might be some poor people that decide that they do not want to live anymore and that they do want to kill themselves. And we've got no problem with that, right? Because that is their own decision. They have decided that it's simply not enjoyable for them to be alive, and the net future utility of them being alive is outweighed by the harm that they experience by being alive. And for those people, yes, it might be both rational and the decision that they make. But for other people who don't make the decision, we simply don't see any benefit in making that decision for them. Not only do we think that there is inherent value in having human life, as we brought to it first, but we also tell you that if there is value in these people's specific lives, shown by the fact that they want to continue to survive, that we should choose to celebrate that. We also tell you that all of this value being based upon future projections shouldn't be the calculus in this debate. Because if that was the case, if Shah and Chin wanted to get up here and say, well, things are going to get worse, then maybe, even in the most hardline example, maybe they'd choose to all kill themselves when things did get worse. But the matter of fact is, it's the opposite. Things are looking up for these people. Things are going to get better. In fact, we told you at Liam that there are signs that the Ice Age is actually ending. You could see in certain shots, like deer and stuff running around on the ice, showing that actually there is some life that is still alive. We tell you that it's actually possible, especially under Curtis, who is equitable, to have enough resources to lead expedition teams to see maybe when the ice is thawing, maybe the certain places that humans can start to repopulate. But even if that wasn't the case, we tell you that the kind of environment that they're able to live in on the train as it stands is better than any Paleolithic caveman, right? However, no one, I doubt anyone in this debate would get up here and say that, well, humans shouldn't exist right now because all of the Paleolithic cavemen who are doing cave paintings and getting killed by dinosaurs or whatever should off themselves, right? Because obviously that isn't the case. For these reasons, we are proud to negate. Thank you.
Thank you to that speaker for their speech. And now I'd like to invite the third affirmative speaker to conclude their team's case.
Can you hear me all right? You can't just use examples of people who live agonizing lives every day and choose not to kill themselves as a justification for why we should continue to allow people to suffer through that existence. The unfortunate matter of the fact is that we are paralyzed and trapped by our own biology, by our own cultural institutions, by capitalist corporations that have decided to brainwash us into believing that we have some kind of life purpose to live on this earth. We are trapped and we are unable to make a free choice about whether or not we should actually end our lives. We are unable to legitimately see or whether we are happy or not. And that is why Curtis should take matters into his own hands and make that choice on behalf of other people. In my speech, I'm going to look at three things. Firstly, about why we should take a utilitarian calculus instead of caring about some artificial idea of some life sanctity. Secondly, just looking at the reality of hope, will the earth thaw? And then thirdly, talking about how whether you can fix a train and reform it. So firstly, about the utilitarian calculus we should take, because what we told you was that there is no sanctity of life. The ideas that people have that they should continue living for some higher purpose are made up and a lie. It's your biology telling you that you should do it to survive. It's religion telling you to do it. It's capitalism telling you to do it. So wealthier elites can profit off of your body and you don't off yourself and you continue to produce labor, right? These are things that prevent you from taking your life. It's very unfortunate that people are coerced into suffering for the benefit of others, right? So what we heard from the other team was firstly just like, oh, well, if all lives are true, what about future lives? Char already told you why, like, it's not a real harm until they experience it, right? Until those future people come into existence, they don't suffer the same as the people who necessarily exist today. So we should prioritize them. But even if that was true, we think it's very likely that they will continue to suffer, not only because it's unlikely that the Earth will thaw, but even if the Earth thaws, the society that's reestablished will be just as fucked up as the one that's on the train currently, right? And then we try to hear this thing from Oscar about how involuntary euthanasia is really mean, right? And it's unethical. Firstly, you can't pretend that everyone has like perfect consent in this world, right? Because on their side of the house, they're going to allow people to be brought into a world that's filled with absolute suffering. Those people don't consent to be born. Those people don't consent to suffer. And just because it's the inverse, bringing them into life instead of taking them out of it, they still suffer. We don't see the difference, and we don't see why they're supporting that policy. But also, secondly, it's not as bad as they want to say because of the fact that these people would make that choice if they could, right? People who are unable to make decisions on their behalf because they're mentally ill or because, oh, Jesus, because they don't have the capacity to do it, or other people make decisions on behalf of them. We think this is one of the rare instances where the pain that people are suffering is so bad and so severe, and also is a detriment to their ability to think reasonably and rationally, that this should be an instance where we're allowed to make that choice on behalf of other people. Also, just note on the Holocaust example, that's completely different, right? In those instances, you just had to make it out of Europe. That gave people hope, and that was a way. There was a way to stop the suffering. We don't think that exists in this world. But also note that some people did just give up, right? It's not as like absolute as they wanted to say, and they can't get away with portraying these inspiring messages about a life that isn't worth living. Also, just note that the negative team seems to think that it's ethical to torture somebody just to make the rest of their life seem more tolerable. They are okay with pushing people to suffer every single day, encouraging them to like partake in cannibalism because they think that makes it more tolerable when you get to finally eat a cockroach. Delicious. I don't understand in what world they feel good about forcing people to suffer because they think it makes life better. I'll take that POI.
There are a lot of people alive in the world right now who consider the mere fact that on this train with redistribute resources that you get to nowhere that you're having a meal every day is like a big upgrade. Given that these people are unlikely to get help, and it's probably uncharitable I say you would just help them, do you think they should just end their lives?
Okay, I agree that poverty in the modern world sucks, right? But you need to remember the specific context of the debate is that people are on a train, but not only are they living in cultural and economic oppression, but also on top of that, they are literally unable to live as biological animals, right? They don't have enough fresh air. They don't have access to natural light. They don't have enough space. They don't have free will. They don't have autonomy. They have no hope of making any choice or actually eating consistent food, even if you manage to prove that there's enough fish on the train to feed 500 people when the demand, when the supply is only enough to meet the demand of 50 people, right? It's ridiculous, and we think you are trying to glorify a situation that will never get better. Second point, will the Earth thaw? Look, I don't know if Oscar paid attention during the important parts in the movie, but even if there was a little, deer floating around in the snow, just remember that that is one season, probably summer or spring, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to actually grow food in the ground, right? That doesn't change the fact that the temperature is so cold that for the vast majority of seasons of the year, people are killed, people literally die if they exit the train, right? It is impossible for people to grow anything or maintain society outside of the train. Also, just note that even if an ice age thaws in 500 years, it doesn't matter because we don't care about the artificial, maybe hypothetical lives of people who might live. We care about stopping the suffering that people are experiencing today. Also, just note that they never responded to our material about the precariousness of the situation on this train. The train literally can't be fixed, right? You can't leave it if there's an engineering fuck up. You can't go and fix a train. You might be thrown off the tracks by a landslide, which is very likely given the fact that there are natural disasters on the world, right? It is highly unlikely you will make it to see 50 years, let alone 500. We don't think that is a good enough reason to force people to literally kill, destroy their souls, to eat cockroaches, to eat babies, right? That's terrible. Final point then about can you fix a train? The material we initially heard from the negative team was that Curtis is going to try to be a good person because he values lives and he experiences poverty, or he experienced poverty. That doesn't matter, right? Because the reality is, what can he actually do? This is a numbers game, right? You are very unlikely to be able to increase the amount of resources available to feed people. Also came up here and told us, look, some resources aren't finite. There are entire carriages dedicated to farming. Yes, there are carriages. A finite amount of fish exists within those carriages, right? What's going to happen when suddenly you increase the amount of people who are allowed to eat fish or who want to eat fish from 50 to 500 or to 1,000? all of a sudden people feel justified in getting those fish, and they eat them, and they eat them at a rate where they can't like replenish the population, right? So it becomes unsustainable, tragedy of the commons. It's very unlikely that they'll be able to actually continue to produce food at the same rate that they could when they were producing it for just a small amount of people. But also just note, even if they did manage to have buffet carts that could feed people sushi, that was only enough for a tiny amount of people, right? All of a sudden you have heaps of people who not only have been craving and wanting the sushi for ages, but have specifically fought and killed people and are bloodthirsty and no thank you, and want to get revenge on the people who have shot at them and who have ruined their lives for 50 or 100 years. When people are in a mob, when people are angry, that is when they feel justified to take more than they deserve. That is when they start to eat more food. That's when they start to have infighting. And it doesn't take everybody doing it, right? It just takes one person to set off the cycle of greed. So soon as the first person decides that they're entitled to more fish than is necessary to allow those resources to replenish, other people start to get defensive. They start to take more. It's very, very hard to maintain control over the population. What do we hear from them? Well, they said actually no, Curtis earned the respect of lots of people at the back of the train. The thing is, it's very, very easy to inspire people when you're in the middle of warfare, right? Because they're able to see a credible threat. You're able to paint yourself as a good guy, and you're able to make a narrative that appeals to them. When reality sets in, and when you try to have a stable society, it's very unlikely that they listen to you just because you proved yourself in wartime, right? That doesn't carry on. But also just note that the rebellions were never going to stop, right? This wasn't just the one successful revolution. There were previous revolutions. And the whole point of revolutions is that you need something to keep the people sane so they don't kill themselves from the cramped conditions they live in that will never satisfy the human condition, right? You are either going to have to continue to kill people or to force them to kill one another in order to like let them prevent overpopulation and keep the population sane. Lives deserve, we should judge this debate based on the amount of like improvement you bring to people who are like alive today. We are the only team that does that. Very proud to affirm.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech, third affirmative, and I'd like to invite the third negative speaker to conclude the debate.
Let's do a quick reality check about which situation seems to have more consent. Is it one person unilaterally deciding to murder absolutely everyone else? Or is it a group of individuals, some of whom may perhaps have, like environmental, biological factors working on them, making those kind of individual decisions, given that we know that suicide is like physically possible because people have done it before, right? Let's be real. It's not the one guy making the decision for everyone else, is it? It's people having the ability to decide whether or not they think this is. They are rational thinkers. They're able to make that kind of decision. We think they live in pretty terrible circumstances. And if even those aren't enough to make them think that their life isn't worth living, that's something that's up to them. Okay, 3 things of speech. Firstly, is humanity worth saving? Secondly, what's the situation like if they have to stay on the train forever? Thirdly, why there actually is hope that they won't have to stay on the train forever. Okay, firstly, is humanity worth saving? Okay, first thing to say here is that we don't think being anthropocentric is like an issue here because there's not a lot else left to trade off with, right? Like we don't think there's like a competing interest here, so you can be anthropocentric if you want because like there's basically only humans and like a couple of deer. We think that in this situation, the utilitarian calculus is going to be an abominable thing to use. Why is that? Because we think the value of human life, and the reason why we like debate about it so often is because it's something that's very difficult to quantify and put into tangible terms, but something that we feel very strongly, right? Like it's something that's like emotional and it's intangible and it's based on things that you can't count up or weigh, like relationships, right? And when you put them in utilitarian calculus against things like barrels of wheat or amount of cockroaches we can transfer, that very quickly leads your mind to focus on the concrete things. That means you make terrible calculuses on the utilitarian basis because you can't quantify it. That's why it's so difficult to prove in any context. But does that mean it doesn't exist? No, because that's something that humans throughout society, from the point where we were cavemen just being picked off by the lion that stalked around our little encampment and we didn't even know if we'd be able to eat every day, made that choice to go for it. We think that at the end of this debate, it is crucially important that we have to acknowledge that people do not want to die, and we cannot make that decision that they should want to die, even if they are able to rationalize that that's the correct decision, right? Because they can go till the cows come home about why we shouldn't care about future generations, But if people don't agree with you and they don't want to do it, then you shouldn't make that kind of decision for them, because that is just brutally murdering someone. We think that lots of people care about future generations. We think that people who were in Auschwitz didn't know that they were going to be liberated, but they cared about the idea of there being a future generation. They cared about the idea that they might be able to pass on a culture or relationship. We think the same is true of cave people who had literally nothing except rocks, right? Like, we think that this is like, lots of people care about it, even if they prove that we shouldn't. They haven't proven why those people will agree with them. We think that is ridiculous. We think they do have joy, they do have relationship, and also that situations change, right? We think it's not just the system that's telling them they can't kill themselves, right? Because the system's abandoned them, right? Like, they've been abandoned to the point with cannibalism and stuff. So I don't think they're people that are hugely religious. I don't think they're people who agree with capitalism and think that they have to keep living. I think they're incredibly disenfranchised, but they still thought that being on this earth as well. So it's not just enough of them to say, well, oh, capitalism told us that we should work until we die. We think that that's for individuals to decide. It's really problematic you start making those decisions for people, right? This is the same kind of logic that leads people to think that if someone's disabled, then their life isn't worth as much as another person because they're supposedly locked into constant suffering, right? Like, we think this is really heinous logic that's been used throughout history, because people try to use those utilitarian calculuses about, like, well, I know walking is good versus what is like the value of human life and stuff like that. We think people are totally irrational here. That is far more irrational than just listening to a biological impulse. And the worst case scenario is that you live, but you still have that flame of hope inside you. We know that people are capable of committing suicide if they want to. They do so even in circumstances that are objectively better than those kind of situations. We think most of those people shouldn't have done so, because we think that those are like, you know, we wish that they had had a better life in a better situation. But we think that this is the scenario we have to say that the consent is with the person who actually makes the decision for themselves. Next, situation on the train, why it's not actually going to be that bad. Firstly, we think that they probably should have just like Googled the movie a bit more before they ran their first two speeches on this, because they were totally nonsensical when it came to the canon. So we've already told you this is a massive cruise liner train, right? This is probably nicer than the apartments that some people living in Hong Kong have right now, right? Like, they say cramped conditions, no sunlight, you know. This is objectively not true, particularly in those new cabins that have been opened up. They're going to have windows, right? Like, this isn't like the worst case scenario on earth. It's better than some people's actual living conditions right now. And they have all the basics, which is shelter, they have food, they have sanitation, they don't necessarily need to die in those circumstances. We think that they are overemphasizing the degree to which this is suffering, right? Because we know the greatest joy in life comes from other people, right? Not things. Like, this sounds really abstract, right? But like, most of us manage to live happy lives even knowing that other people have more than us. And we think that this is true of people that are in this book, like, in this train. Next, they tried to tell us like, oh, there's going to be overpopulation. Firstly, I don't know why they can't establish a really strong culture of not having sex, right? Like, this actually works pretty effectively in a lot of religious countries. Like, sure, it's not foolproof and you have a few people who break through it, right? But we think that like, in that situation, you can still have cultural norms that say it's generally bad for the population if we're having babies willy-nilly. We think we should stop doing that so we don't have to have another cull. That's pretty easy to explain to people. If like, please don't have sex, all have to start murdering people, most people are going to make that calculus rationally. We think that that's fine. Next, we think that this is the first successful revolution, right? So Grace was really the only speaker that tried to grapple with this without being canonically wrong, right? So essentially, she just told us that, like, well, even if you have enough resources, we're going to have people acting greedy. We're going to have this particular situation where everyone tries to grab and get what they can. Firstly, we think that that's very manageable because of all the characterization we gave you of Curtis as a leader, is that he's someone who's particularly well placed to explain to people why they shouldn't do that. And we told you that people are already beholden to him to the point where they followed him into a revolution against people with guns while they had nothing, right? So he's a pretty strong authority figure for these people. And that's already proven by the fact they've gotten to this point. So we think he's probably able to tell you that this isn't a good idea to go crazy in the tragedy of the commons. And we also think that, again, the worst case scenario is that you go back to eating cockroaches, but we told you that even that situation is something that people can logically opt in to have, and something that many people do opt in to have. We think that they can just, they think that they want to avoid the situation they've just been through. If they want to talk about humans being able to make rational choices, right? We think that this is a situation where they can act rationally. Do they want to suffer? No, they're probably going to choose to listen to someone who talks about redistributing the resources and not do the exact same thing over again. We think that generally speaking, this is the first revolution on this train, right? They've been saying things like, oh, there have been other revolutions, other system governments, right? Like, we think that revolutions can be really good for putting in place new system governments, right? That's essentially how the Netherlands exists right now. Like, that's a whole country that functions pretty good out of a revolutionary society. And we think that just saying like, oh, well, revolution science failed doesn't automatically mean we're going to go into analysis of dictatorship. We think we set it up pretty good, and they've never dealt with any of our detailed analysis there. Next scenario, they get off the train. I mean, it's pretty intuitively true that we just win the debate if we think there's any hope that you get off the train, right? Because lots of people care about future scenarios. And we don't think it's a case of how long it takes you to get there, because lots of people care about future humans even if they don't see them, right? That's why we care about climate change in the now, because like we don't want people in the future to die. We think that this means that we can still have the train as a life vessel, right? So we're not talking about like you go from living on the train to just leaving the train and striking out, right? We're talking expeditions. We're talking using the train as a life vessel to support it, where you start to make satellite settlements. We're talking the fact that he's probably a good person to do this because he cares very much about the people and making sure they care about us, and people are very invested in him. So we think that we think that those kind of incursions into the world, which they already know is showing some hope of thawing, are going to be really important for people's hope, and only add to the fact that they want to stay alive and they want to have more people stay alive as well. We think this is crucially important, that hope still exists for so many people on this train, and that for Curtis to say that they are stupid, that they are irrational, that they're being held prison by biology, is for him to be hubris, for him to have hubris, for him to be as bad as the original controller. That is not who he is. It's not what he should do. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that speech, and generally, thank you for that debate. I think we're going to move to a breakout room, i.e. the judges, to deliberate. Can I just get a confirmation on that?
Yep, I'll pop you into some breakout rooms.
Thank you.